Welcome to another episode of the Gay Barchives Show, where we explore gay history one bar at a time. I'm your host, Art Smith, and today our special guest is author, drag queen, and business consultant Tom LeNoble. He recently published his book, My Life in Business Suits, Hospital Gowns, and High Heels. So, welcome to the show, Tom.
It's great to be here, Art. I've been looking forward to being with you.
And I've been looking forward to this segment. It's not every day that you encounter somebody who has, a long and storied history with gay bars and the gay community on the level that you have, and has even documented some of it in your book, My Life in Business Suits, Hospital Gowns, and High Heels. So you give a multifaceted perspective of your life and of what the gay community was like back in the day when you were first starting to come out. So I'm looking forward to hearing your stories. I understand you've had some pretty interesting times in Atlanta, in Florida, San Francisco, Hawaii, and up the East Coast. So let's start with Atlanta because that's where the Gay Barchives project started. And tell me a little bit about your experiences with the Atlanta bar scene.
Well, Atlanta was interesting because I came out in Florida in the early 70s. And after I lived in Florida and had a whole personality there, and then moved to South Florida and did my first stint at the Marlin, I ended up in Atlanta. And when I ended up in Atlanta, I ended up and landed at Stephen's Saloon. And Stephen owned two bars, one in Detroit and one in Atlanta. And the interesting thing about it that's really fun is my best friend now, we're getting ready to celebrate 50 years. She moved from San Francisco. I moved from South Florida. We landed in Atlanta at the same time in the gay bar. She was the bookkeeper and I was the manager. And that was the beginning of our wonderful, wonderful relationship going forward. But when I landed there, um, it was really a great experience because I had landed in Atlanta and all the bars were going on there from Backstreet to Illusions to Shelley's to you name it. All the hot bars, Bulldogs at the time were thriving. The bar scene was. And I remember arriving at Stevens and my welcome was Steven had a party for me and his favorite drink was Ouzo. And I remember the next day waking up and this guy named, I think his name was Jerry St. Michael's, but I didn't know where I was. But all I could see was there were doves flying around. And I thought, oh dear God, I have gone to heaven. There's doves flying around my head. And then I realized my head felt the size of three basketballs. And I had the worst hangover of life and swore that there would never ever be a drop of ouzo in my mouth again, and there never has been since. But after that, we went on, and I'm sure your viewers have heard about the madness at Crazy Days on Sundays when we would have drink specials every few minutes, and people would get quite toasted. And we also had party seasonal. We do Christmas in July and decorate for, everything went on there. It was a great little space with in a strip mall kind of feel with wooden panels from the outside. It was very nondescript. But it was pretty interesting because Stephen, having two bars, sort of acted like he owned a chain of McDonald's. He was trying to put in a corporate structure and corporate training. And, I can remember there were times Donna and I would run to the bank in the morning for with the yesterday's proceeds just to be able to make payroll because there was so much money going towards this corporate influence. And then Donna and I became like characters. The bar did around where Tommy Oosterhout, for people that remember him of Sunset Magazine, started this thing. And Black Bart was Steven, I was Matt Dillon, Donna was Lily Langtree, and all these people had these cast of characters he started to write about in his columns. And even at one point, Donna and I were asked to go be the judges at some local either drag contest or something like that because we had gotten that reputation for doing it. So it was a fun time. And it ended when Black Bart, Stephen, was coming to town. And word was that he had had enough because guess I wasn't cooperating with his corporate structure. And so I left town, and it was a pretty fun time of how that all got written up before I finally left Stevens and moved on. But it was a great time in Atlanta. Back then, there was just so much party freedom. It was, obviously pre the horrible epidemic of AIDS, and that it was just the summer of love all over again, except in our gay life. And so much fun to go around. We would leave Stevens and drop by Shelley's for a drink and say hello to everybody, end up in Backstreet dancing, and then end up on Cheshire Bridge Road, or start out there at the Sweet Gumhead with the fabulous, Rachel Wells hot chocolate, all the stars of the day that were there, so many of them that turned out to be so fabulous. And then of course Charlie Brown, the icon we all know, was still in her way, and people like Gilda Golden and some of these just fabulous performers, Kitty Litter, which if you never got to see the real Kitty Litter, and Levita, and all these people that were just so special, Diamond Lil, that you would see around town, and they were living and breathing characters that went on far out of the bar.
Yeah, it was a magical time in Atlanta. I didn't move there until '83. So the Gumhead was already gone by then, but I did know a lot of those players, and they did maintain a very strong presence in Atlanta for decades. I was fortunate enough to actually interview Charlie Brown not long before he passed, and that took about 2 years to set up. Charlie was not exactly the most technologically gifted person on the planet, but he was a great guy, and I'd known him for 35 years, and it was so rewarding to be able to capture his story. And we focused mostly on his early days. So in the interview with him, we talked mostly about the Watch Your Hat and Coat Saloon in Nashville, and then Sweet Gumhead in Atlanta. That was the primary focus. But the scene there, even in the early '80s, which was before AIDS hit Atlanta so hard. Atlanta didn't get hit hard until the later part of the '80s, whereas like New York and San Francisco, and they knew about it earlier. But the bar scene was dynamic. There were 25, 30 bars around town. Everybody went to all the bars. You didn't just go to one. You had
So cool.
Tuesday night was here, Sunday afternoon was there. And it was an amazing scene, particularly for the deep South. When you think about it, Atlanta's in the heart of Dixie. And to have this vibrant nightlife and these neighborhoods like Midtown that you had, gay people everywhere was amazing. So
Yeah. Yeah, so much fun. I remember, at Illusions was the Glamour sisters, Amber Richards and Vicki Lawrence and Sheena Black, and all these stars. In fact, Vicki and I became good friends, and we tried to date for a while, but I think we couldn't figure out who wanted to wear the dresses most. But I had this great experience where I said to Vicki, I was working at a private psychiatric hospital running a lab at the time, and I said, Vicki, they're having a Christmas party and I want to take you to it. And it was, I think, at the Hyatt Regency downtown. It was this huge atrium, and it was taking up 2 floors. And so she said yes. And so, as you can imagine, it was all these hospital people from, it was like a chain of 3 different hospitals that were private that came together. And so Vicky got all done up, and we were driving there, and she had curlers and that wonderful hair she had, and this gorgeous copper bugle bead outfit on. And as we got there, it was raining, and she said, "I'm not getting out in the rain." So I remember pulling up on the sidewalk, letting her get under an awning, and she said, "I'll be ready when you get back." And I went and parked the car, came back, and when I came back, she had pulled the curlers out and all that gorgeous hair, and there she was. Well, we walked in the door. And as we walked in the door, she walked a little ahead of me. She slipped off the jacket, drug it with one finger behind her as she, you know, slid across the room with me behind her, with everybody looking at her. And I remember two of the psychiatrists I worked with, one of them who was gay, walked up to me and said, "Boy, do you have balls." And I thought, what a statement to make. Here I am with Vicky in the middle of her performance, and he's asking me, saying about what balls people have. But what a performance that was of people back then, and such superstars that happened and turned into just the best play. Tasha Wallace, I could go on for Lisa King, these people that were so amazing. And then, of course, all the guys that performed as well that were of the day that were back then. That it was just, like you said, such a vibrant scene, and everybody was really one big family. That's how it was treated. No matter which bar you went to, people just were really accepting of you, and it was kind of fun. You'd have your there was drag going on, and there was all the other drag. Because if you went to Bulldogs, you had to get in that outfit for that genre. If you're going dancing, you had to get in that outfit. It was always something. Yeah, so it was loads of fun.
Well, that was another thing too about Atlanta that was different for me because my other experiences prior to that in gay bars, one was at the Hippo in Baltimore, one was at the Warehouse 28 in Nashville. They were kind of, laid back, everyday attire, basic gay bars with dance floors and such. But Atlanta had a lot of specialized bar. And I remember when I went to Illusions, and fortunately, that's another one, I got to interview Ted Binkley about a year before he passed away, also known as Dora DeVille. And Ted Binkley was one of the owners of Illusions and got to capture some of his stories, which go back. His first gay bar experience was in the early 1950s, which was, that's kind of incredible when you think about it now, almost 75 years ago. But the one thing I remember about Illusions is that you always felt like you had to be freshly shaven and nicely dressed. You didn't go in there in shredded shorts and grubby t-shirts. It was special. And that was an unusual thing for me because you were so used to so many of the gay bars before then being grimy little backdoor hole in the wall places that you were almost embarrassed to be in, but you went there because you had to meet your tribe. And at Illusions and even Backstreet and some of the other bars, you felt like you were, you had something special. They were, more elaborate. They put money into them. You felt like you were going somewhere special. And that was a really big turning point for me with my gay bar experiences because of the nature of the bars in Atlanta. So many of the Gallus, the restaurant and bar,
Yes, yes.
um, you went there and you felt like you were going somewhere nice for dinner. You weren't going to some grimy, greasy hole, spoon somewhere. So it definitely was a magical time.
That's what you do for us, Art. Just then, you named three bars: the Hippo, which I lived in Baltimore for a while, and the Gallus. You bring our memories back to life for us of all these places we were in that sometimes we remember, sometimes in the fog of what we were doing during those days. We have to, dig the memory up like a lava lamp bubbling up. But it's so true, and that it was just such a great time of people being able to just be free. I remember we called Atlanta the big city that was a small town, and you'd walk in Piedmont Park and you'd meet people and see people that you'd seen the night before, and it was also just a great time of, I think, people being willing to be together, and there was a family feel to the community, I think, at that time. I remember the first time I met Charlie Brown. We were both in a contest, Miss Jacksonville Beach. And I grew up in Jacksonville Beach, and I remember going there as Rita Dayworth, my alternate ego. And I was walking down First Street, imagining what was going to happen if my mother and father drove by, because it was still a little tiny town. And Miss Jack's Beach happened, and Charlie was in it, and so many of the other superstars. And Charlie and I met, and we had a great rapport from the start, along with her boyfriend, who was been with her so many years and was back then. And we were all so young.
Fred,
And Fred, yeah, Fred, way back then. And um, Charlie and I, through the years, always remembered each other. Of course, later on in life, when I moved to California, a lot of those people were memories to me because I was gone. But what an amazing human being of what she did for Atlanta gay people, the AIDS crisis, all of that. And um, my brother died in 1985 of AIDS out here in San Francisco, and I ended up coming out and spending the last 10 days of his life. And when I went back home to Atlanta, I became an AIDS buddy at Aid Atlanta. And you got to see the other side and the beginning of what was going on and some horrors that I saw and witnessed that happened during that time before I left. You moved to Atlanta in '83, which is right when I went back to run the Marlin Beach Hotel for Cliff, which we'll get into later. But I lived in Atlanta twice, the first time for 12 years, and then I was back there for three. Um, at a later date when I was for corporate work, when my corporate life. And I just have such fond memories of, we forgot about the Far Library and how much fun that
Oh,
was. And
oh my
Limelight
God.
wasn't really a gay bar. It was a gay bar, Limelight, of going there when you do it on a special occasion. And you felt like we had our own little Studio 54 going on. And I'm dying to remember the name of this bar because it's the first time I met RuPaul. RuPaul was a little kid. It was out on Cheshire, past Cheshire Bridge on one of the side streets, and Roski Fernandez was there and some other people. And I remember RuPaul as a little kid. Of course, we were both kids and wandering around through the that bar as well as Sweet Gumhead. Now, Sweet Gumhead was the showplace of the South. That's what it was called for a long time in those early days. And I'm going to tell you a secret. The people that performed there were incredible. There is nobody like Rachel Wells. Rachel Wells has a walk that nobody could ever match. The only person that's ever even come close to being able to have a walk and wasn't the same, but equals Chad Michaels of being able to really encompass that. And I remember when I was managing the Marlin, drag had never been there, and I decided to bring drag. And so I contacted Vicky, Dina, and Rachel. Vicky had just won Miss Florida, and Dina's Dina Jacobs, and Rachel's Rachel Wells, and I conspired with them, and we brought to Tea Dance out by the pool on the second level above the upper deck was this big space. And I remember going to John Kiss, the building manager, and asking him how sturdy it was. And he said to me, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "You don't need to know what I'm going to do. I just know if it'll hold people up." Because I knew it would get back to Bill and Cliff, who were out of town at the time. And we conspired and had this magnificent on Labor Day. They did all three of them did shows right there, and we brought the place down, and that was the beginning of the first of drag at the Marlin Beach Hotel, which they swore would never happen. And they were just incredible. These are entertainers. I think Dina's getting ready to have her 79th birthday, and I don't know where John Rachel is these days. I haven't seen. I see his picture every now and then, but these were a whole different phase of drag than we have now, a whole different time when you really wanted to do female impersonation. And it wasn't about could you do flips and splits, which we all love RuPaul today. But back then it was much more about the true art of female impersonation from back then. And then there was Daytona. I'm sure you've heard all about Daytona and some of those bars that were so much fun with Billy Boots and that crowd that were
Absolutely.
down there. And really, it was just such a fun time. And, drag had that big boom then and never went away, but it had its ebbs and flows over time before we have what we have now.
But back then, as you mentioned, with Sweet Gumhead being the showplace of the South, which that mantle was later taken on by Illusions. I think they stole that tagline um, after Gumhead closed. But there were and as I mentioned earlier, the one in Nashville, Watch Your Hat and Coat Saloon, and then later they opened Jerry Peak opened the Cabaret. They had big production style drag houses. It wasn't like it is now, where it's somebody that is the teller at your local bank, or the flipping hamburgers at the Greasy Spoon, and then at night throws on a random wig and struts across the stage. These were people, and I've interviewed several people about Sweet Gumhead. I interviewed Marty about his book, which is all about Sweet Gum Head. I've interviewed Mark Jones, who was the
Mark,
choreographer
oh, Mark
there.
was everywhere back
Um, and and of course, Charlie talks about it in his interview. They spent 7 days a week or 6 days a week at the bar. They had rehearsals and meetings and choreography, and it was a full-time job. You could not, you have to devote your life to being on that stage at Sweet Gumhead if you planned on being there more than one night. And I have desperately tried to interview John Greenwell, Rachel Wells.
Yes.
My understanding is he lives in rural Georgia, I think, and has sketchy internet connections, and he really can't do a streaming interview. Hopefully, one day he will, but right now it hasn't happened. But it was an amazing time, and they really, like I said, they devoted their lives to their crafts. I mean, we had later on we had Amber Richards, who was another big name in
They
Atlanta. Um, we had Lily White, who was the
really,
antithesis
yeah,
of beautiful drag.
unbelievable. Unbelievable.
And I didn't get to interview Lily either because he was in hospice by the time I started
Yeah.
doing these interviews.
Well, back in the
Um,
day, Lily White and Kitty Litter were actually, they performed together. They had a show they did together. And
yeah,
you're absolutely right about the costumes because I can remember when Vicky and Chyna and Tasha and Amber, they would be do their shows at night and be back in, like you just said, the bar in the daytime. Tasha sewed and made all their costumes, and they would be there and they would rehearse. These were not, these were like production numbers. There was no room for error. The dancing, they, choreographed everything, even the pageants back then when you went to Miss Florida. It was more than a show. You felt like you had gone to Las Vegas with some of the stuff that went on. I remember the year Vicky won, she had a black cougar. She did Dreams by Jefferson Airplane with this crystal coffin, and she disappears. And when they pull the top of it off the cloth, there's a black cougar there in a live black cougar with the same necklace that she was wearing when she disappeared. And and I can remember even back in the day, people doing cabaret would have these elaborate sets and stuff. So it was the time of really doing it up and doing it more. It was theater. It was not only drag shows, it was theater. These were professionals. They just happened to be doing female impersonation.
absolutely. And they were incredible at it. They were an amazing people. They were very social, they were very well known, not like today where you might walk down the street and walk past the drag queen you saw last night and not recognize them. They were celebrities, they were the stars of our community. And one important factor, and I've brought this up numerous times in conversations about gay Barchives, but one of the important factors is that they drove the fundraising for the all the HIV organizations. Um, they helped us build all these other organizations like GLAD and Equality and everything else. It was the drag queens that were the face of these organizations. You know, people like to talk about drag queens and trans people led the march on Stonewall. They led the march around the country, one city at a time, being the face of the community, donating their time and talent to raise money and supporting what the community needed at that time and helping us build um, a bigger and stronger community to the point where we are. I know the last year has been questionable, but we've moved forward a lot with LGBTQ rights. And back then it
Oh,
was the drag queens that were in front of the line.
it's so true. More about it later at another time, but I've been working on something that really is looking at this time of divisiveness and watching our community even today starting to fracture a bit. And if you look in history, just decade by decade, you'll see that we never won when we fractured. We only won when we came together. And I've been focused on something that I'm building to be sure that we remember that we're all under one umbrella and that we're much stronger together than we'll ever be broken apart. And I know that's controversial for some people today, but we don't win when we fracture. And they, the people you're talking about, demonstrated for us how that happens. Today, some of the Transact here in San Francisco, Suzanne Ford, the executive director of San Francisco Pride, she's all over the place, all over the country all the time, standing up in the face of trans rights. And still today, some of the people that are the trailblazers for us of keeping that alive. But hopefully, we understand as a community, if we look back through history, again, we have made such strides from the days even when I came out. I can remember being in the Melody Club in the early days, and I was 17 because I was one of those kids that started school when I was 5. And we'd get raided every now and then, and they would hide me in the drag queen dresses, which never smelled very good, I got to remember. But they would hide me because there was no way out except the front door, and there were the police were. And um, you don't experience that today. We don't experience some of that where we're threatened or we have to hide like we used to, and we need to ensure that that never happens again.
Well, you mentioned the Melody Club, and that might be a good segue into your Florida adventures. For those who don't know, the Melody Club um, was a tiny little gay club in a tiny little town of Gainesville, Florida, um, that goes way back before you would even expect Gainesville to have a gay bar. And they made quite an impression on the community. It's still there. I still hear people talking about the Melody Club. So
Yeah,
why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience with the Melody Club?
yeah, Art, we got away with so much back then because people really didn't have a clue what was going on. They just were enamored watching us. But the Melody Club, I moved to Gainesville to go to school, and I was finally out of the house in Jacksonville Beach. And I remember my first day, my first night setting foot in the Melody Club. I went with a friend, and as we walked in the door, I looked over and it was this one big room and everybody was together. There was only one gay bar. And in some of the bigger cities back then, the women had bars, the men had bars, and you didn't go to each other's unless you were invited. But in the Melody Club in Gainesville, there was one. So everybody from the leather, the drag, the preppy people, you name it, was all under one roof. But we walked in and I remember going in the door, and there was a bar, and then seating, and then this stage. And I saw this person on the stage, and I said out loud, "Oh my God, that's the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." And I remember it was somebody named Miss E doing Maybe by the third degree, the 3 degrees. And somebody at the door looked at me and said, "You do know that's a man?" And I went, "No." So that was my first introduction to the Melody Club in this little strip mall. C.L. Hilliard was the owner. And every night when the Melody Club closed, he would say, "Hotel motel time, Hunnis." And that's how you knew it was time to leave the bar and the lights would come on. And he was quite a character too. And Tody Martell was the show director who had come from Atlanta. Well, I was there and started going there. In fact, started getting a little wild there. And that's actually when I will come to it later. But when I first met Cliff Hovan, was we were kids back then. And his name was actually Cliff Pomeroy. And Douglas Morris, my best friend that I'd grown up with, had come to Gainesville too. And so we started hanging out there. And so the very first Miss Central Florida pageant happened. And I remember we had stars of our own, like Penny Holiday and Diane Adams, and Apple Love wasn't there yet, but she came later. And Young Gifted in Black was Laverne, Lachey, and Penny had a group. There were all these people that were performing there. And so Miss Central Florida came, and Anne Marie came from Atlanta and won it. And that night, as I did later with Dana Manchester and a few others, which is in the book, I walked up to Jimmy and I said, "Do you have an escort for the evening?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Well, I need to be your escort then." And he said, "Sure." And so I escorted Jimmy around. We ended up at CL's house, which was always a scene. And long story short, Jimmy and I eventually end up in a relationship, and we're together for quite a while. Um, and it was it was my first time in a relationship with a guy, and it was very, very, very special. And then I remember we were at the Melody Club one night, and they announced there was going to be a talent show, it was the first time of having a talent show, and we we were a little lit. And so Doug and Cliff and I looked at each other and said, probably Doug and I, because we were theater kids, and said, we need to be in this talent show. And we convinced Cliff. So Cliff was Clitorcia and was horrible. Doug was Sally Summers, and I don't remember what my name was, but we brought the house. Doug and I brought the house down, and Toady looked at me and announced that I was Rita Dayworth, and I remember thinking to myself, "Oh, this is like being back on the stage again in theater." And I was a starving student and thought, I bet I could make some money at this, which started Rita Dayworth's career: 4 nights a week, 2 shows a night, traveling around the South, being in pageants and at the Melody Club. And it wasn't shy of things. I remember one night, I was the first night I'd ever wore red hair, and CL was trying not to pay us, and I slapped him and got barred from the bar. It took a while to get me back in there. And we used to go to Crystal Burger and Full Drag and get burgers. God knows what we looked like under those lights. And there was a Frisch's Big Boy we would go to, and we would dance on the tables. You could never get away with it today, but back then people just thought they were getting another show. And it was a really special time because it was such a small community in a college town that people would come together there. And it wasn't only gay people, we get quite a few straight people. And the lesbians and especially the dykes loved the drag queens. I remember some of the first times where they would walk up and do dollar after dollar after dollar, and they would go wild. The crowd would go wild over it, and was so much fun. And we had a great time there. And the Melody Club went on long after I was there. And finally, another bar opened in town. I think it was called the Spectrum that opened up finally later. But there was nothing like that Melody Club. And time went on, and I know we traveled one time and we had this queen come, and her name was Toby Randall, and we wondered how the hell did she get here? And she had all this portfolio and these headshots and somehow got on for the night. Well, we didn't know, but she was stealing stuff from everybody. And I had this yellow boa that's actually in this picture on the front of my book. And she asked me to borrow it. And I realized the next night when I went to go look for it, it was gone. So she was on her way to the palace in uh, Orlando the next night, and so I called up my buddy Roxanne Russell. I said, Roxanne, this queen's coming there. She's ripping everybody off. She's got my yellow bow. I'm coming down. So I went down, and Roxanne and I conspired together. So Roxanne asked her if she could borrow the yellow boa for a number. So when Roxanne did the number, I walked up and ticked Roxanne, and she took the feather boa off and put it back on my neck and said, "Honey, here's your feather boa back." And then went backstage. Well, that was the end of Toby Randall's career. So we had antics like that going, of course, all the time that were happening. And it was a fun time because, again, it was the only gay bar, and you had to come together as a group. And there were friendships that were forged that were amazing forever of what happened in that little community back then.
Yeah, I was in Gainesville a couple of years ago with a friend. He had to go there for a conference. I think it had to do with HIV and AIDS actually, and he was speaking there. And I went with him, and I believe the only gay bar in Gainesville now is called the University Club, and it's right down the street from the university. I mean, literally, if you had a little bit of stamina and you weren't afraid of, you know, taking a walk, you could walk there from campus. Um, and it still has that small town old charm to it. It's still not a polished gem. You don't walk in there and go, wow, this is a really fancy bar. The people there are very diverse, again, because it's a small town. So even though there are thousands of university students, you also have the locals, you have people in the surrounding areas um, that don't want to drive to Orlando or some other city, and they come out there, and it still has that same kind of feel as it did back 50 years ago. So
Yeah,
it's kind
yeah.
of charming.
Yeah, we always had to sneak away to Jacksonville or Daytona. We'd go to Daytona and see the greats like Billy Boots, Candy Joe, and Billy Joe, and Camille Starr, the people that were the true stars of their day. And then the bar there, I'm trying to think of the name of it, somebody will remember, was started having Miss Gold Coast, and it was a huge, huge pageant that people would go to from everywhere. And you could slip away to Daytona and feel like you were, there was at least two or three or four gay bars, and so you had gone really big time. And Jacksonville was similar to that too, where you had at least a few choices. And Monroe, I can't remember his last name, that owned most of the bars in Jacksonville at the time, back when Charlie was there. And um, I'm trying to remember what her name was. Her last name was Knight. She did Gladys Knight, and there was some superstars there as well. And but we would sneak away from Gainesville we were like going up big towns, right? Big towns, which was back then Jacksonville was big, but it wasn't big as far as what it had to offer. But we were escaping Gainesville.
Yeah, I'm hoping. I've been in touch with one of the bar owners from Daytona from back in the day, Robert Pope, and he owned, I believe, Vagabond in Daytona. And then he moved to St. Pete and he opened the Wedgwood and the Engine Room. And I've spoken to him a few times, but we have not managed to schedule an interview. And of course, he's getting up in years as well. And that makes it a little bit more challenging, I think, technologically. But Daytona definitely had a happening scene for quite a while. And if I'm not
Yes.
mistaken, now there is not an actual gay bar there. There are a couple of gay friendly brew pubs and things like that, but I don't think there's a gay bar in Daytona anymore.
Well, back then, somebody's going to remember there was this disco where they had this Miss Gold Coast that was a little out of town, and it was huge. It was wonderful. It was a great time. It was big. And then the one that was really amazing was called the Bullpen. And it was right on the strip in Daytona. So you can imagine in Bike Week, the kind of clientele that would come walking on the door and see Billy Boots and Candy Joe stripping down to nothing and Camille Starr and all these performers. But it was a little hole in the wall that you walked in the door. It was like a wedge, and the focus was this was the stage, and it was a good time. And but back then there was not a whole lot, but what was going on was packed and a lot of fun. And then even then, it was even when people would come in, they would be enamored with it. There wasn't the kind of controversy unless they were really drunk that even the bikers would come in and want to like watch and see what was going on.
Absolutely. And the whole Florida scene to me, I lived in, like I said, I lived in Atlanta starting in the early 80s, and I was there about 15 years before I moved away. And then I went back for 2.5 years, not so long ago, about 10 years ago. But I remember being in Atlanta at one point, and one of my friends from Nashville, he said, let's go somewhere for the weekend. And so he came down to Atlanta and we flew because this was at the time before all this TSA crap, where you could decide on a dime, yep, we're going to take a flight, go to the airport with a tote bag and buy a ticket. And so we flew down to Fort Lauderdale and just for a long weekend. And you mentioned earlier the Marlin Beach. That's where we stayed. And oh my God, that was another eye opener.
Oh, if the
Um,
walls could talk.
to to be at the Marlin Beach, and you have this hotel, which was not fabulous. I mean, it was a nice place to be. It was convenient. There was a lot going on, but it wasn't a glamorous hotel. It wasn't a
No.
Ritz. But they had a nice restaurant there where you could have, your meals on property. They had that beautiful pool outside. And one of my favorite features was the underground tunnel that went to the beach. So you didn't have to cross A1A and try to get killed on the way to the gate, which became the gay beach, right there
Yeah, and the
in
lower deck where the disco was, with the where you could see these people swimming in the pool.
the
The upper deck,
porthole windows behind the bar.
the poop deck restaurant. Yeah, I was a fabulous poopette for anybody that remembers this t-shirt from way back then. Um, um, I remember I had given up drag and decided I had to have a real life, and I had taken my hospital experience from when I went to school with Gainesville. The whole time I was doing drag, I worked at Shands, which was confusing. I had really long hair, no eyebrows. People would walk up to me and wonder what the hell was going on. But I decided I needed to leave that behind, and I went and worked at Jackson Memorial Hospital. And I remember one day telling Cliff that I'm never going to make any money here. This my boss has been here for 20 years and makes like $1 more an hour than I do. And so Cliff called me one day and said, you know, Johnny Poole, the famous Johnny Poole at the pool bar at the Marlin is retiring. He's leaving. And we got this pool bar. Why don't you come become the pool bartender with Richard Matejko? Well, back then you could work a 4-hour shift and make $500, which back in the 70s was a lot of money for a 4-hour shift. And so I quit my job and off I went to the Marlin Beach. And I worked behind the pool bar with Richard and got all tangled up in that. And of course, since Cliff and I were friends, I was often his house and I was around Bill and got to know a lot about what was going on. And of course, learned all the history of what happened between Bill at the Copa and what happened with Bill Hovan, which was, you know, always kept me at an arm's distance from everybody because I was probably in the Hovan category. But working there was, as you know, if you visited, was so much fun, and people would come from everywhere. It was international, and we had stars like Grace Jones came riding on a motorcycle one time, and all these famous people were there in those early days, and tea dance would just be wild. So people would literally come for brunch, freshen up, come back for afternoon tea dance, go take a nap, and end up back there for dinner and never leave the hotel. They might go across the beach to get a little glow, but they would never leave. And you're right, it wasn't about the hotel itself. It was what was going on in the hotel and the energy that was there. They had the little shop and all the cabanas and the little apartments that for a while um, that were so special. And then Cliff and I decided, I can't remember, he would always have these falling outs with Bill and they would have this big fight. And so they had one, and Cliff and I conspired together that we were just going to leave because if Cliff got in trouble with Bill, then I was going to be in trouble too because I was Cliff's best friend. And so we put together this plan to rent a Jeep and camp and travel across the country. And I remember we went to Key West to start. We bought a Jeep and we took off with all this camping equipment with his dog Sophie, and we were going around the country. We never camped once, by the way, but we ended up going all the way up the East Coast, all these famous bars because Cliff had a reputation and we had all the paraphernalia from the Marlin Beach, and we would get in everywhere. And we landed in Provincetown, got jobs, and one night we were working for about 3 weeks at one of the places in Provincetown and got an apartment, and we woke up in the middle of the night about 3 a.m. and looked at each other and go, what are we doing? We're supposed to be traveling. We left in the middle of the night, didn't tell anybody. We just packed up and left and ended up in San Francisco before he made up with Bill and flew home. But when I got back to the Marlin Beach after that, things weren't the same, and I decided it was time for me to get out of that environment. But back then, you know, it was the place to go. And there were certainly other places, Tacky's and Copa, and there were so many other wonderful places. And again, except for the management of them that always didn't get along or the owners, the people that attended them, it was just one big party after another and loads of fun back there in those days.
Well, and I interviewed John Castelli a while back. In fact, I think that's how we first connected. Was you had watched that interview with John Castelli, and he likes to take credit for bringing the gay beach from Dania Beach to the Marlin Beach. According to his memories, Dania Beach was the gay beach area back
It
then,
was.
and when he came to the Marlin Beach, he decided that he was going to create these little flyers, post them all around Dania Beach and Hollywood and wherever, and say, "Hey, come up to the Marlin Beach. We have a beach and a hotel and a pool and a restaurant and shows." And the next thing you know, Dania Beach wasn't so gay anymore. Um, and then eventually he moved on, and they launched the Copa. So, which I think he had Tangerine first, right? Tangerine was
Tangerine was
before the
first.
Copa.
I remember going to Dania Beach. We would all go and we were like little kids because we could take our clothes off. It was like the coolest thing ever, right? And then, of course, at the Marlin, and I trust John's memory. John was just such a wonderful person in that scene and of championing so much that happened back then. John and I never got to get too close because there was always Bill Hovan in the way or the image of Bill Hovan. And but John ran a great show, and they always treated me great when I went to the Copa, and that was back with my first introduction to Dana Manchester. And once again, I went to Miss Florida and I had gotten really, really tanned and I wore a white tux with a white top hat and went to Miss Florida and we had such a good time and Dana won and I hadn't really known Dana yet. And I walked up to Dana, as I did with Anne Marie, and said, "Do you have an escort for the evening?" And Dana said no. And I said, "Well, would you like one?" And she said, "I would love one," which started Dana and I's friendship. And again, we tried to have a relationship. And um, uh, so it was a very special time of all the people there. I mean, the names of people. Tiffany Ariagas was just wonderful. Maxine Allen, Belle Kincaid, the people that were at the Copa. The great part about that Copa, which Marlin Beach had it later too, where you could travel from bar to bar. But the great thing about the Copa was, you were all really almost on one level, and it was like you were walking from you kind of walked around and it felt like a big circle from experience to experience to experience. And I can remember even they had like this cabana where you could get raw oysters and crab legs and stuff. And the next thing you knew, you were in the show bar and everything else. It was really, really, really special and so much fun. And then, Tacky's was a little tacky and was great. And then there was other little bars but it was a great time, and we had the best DJs at the Marlin and at the Copa, and people would come from all over. You would meet people, and love would blossom, whether it was for an evening or a week, or who knows, maybe a few lifetimes. And for those of us that worked there, especially later when I went back at the managing, we learned about this place was really being held together by a shoestring. I mean, what was going on with the building itself was there was more cosmetic about the building than there was structure holding it up. And if it wasn't for John Kiss, this building, the guy who ran it, the engineer, I'm not sure we would have ever pulled anything off. But I left. That's when I left there, and I ended up in Atlanta, which we talked about. And I remember Cliff called me one day. I think it was '83 and said, "Bill and I are building a house in St. Thomas, and I wanted to know if you'd come down here and run the hotel while we're there." And I had a job, and I was like, okay, I could go back to the Marlin and have this different experience. And of course, it was still hopping. So I said yes and packed up my bags, and I had 28 birds, packed them up, and took them with me. And ended up going down there. And so, for I was there when I first got there, I lived in the hotel for about 3 months, and it happened to be the same 3 months Sylvester had taken a little vacation and was living in the hotel. And Sylvester was so much fun and such a crazy, wild party animal, but so much fun and such a real human being. And Cliff and I, we would have so much fun because the room I was in, nobody knew, but there was this little satellite bar by the pool bar. And I would, for a while before I had the apartment, I was in there, and he and I could be in our room, and people would come sit, or employees on their breaks would sit on the satellite pool bar and tell stories about how much they'd stolen that night or what they had done that night. And the next thing they knew, they weren't there anymore. And people would scratch their head, "How did anybody know about this?" And it was probably because Cliff and I heard them through the window telling what they had done. But um, it was such a great time. And then Cliff and Bill took off, and I went and lived in their house on Middle River Drive. And that's when Dana came and lived with me for a while. And we had this whole huge house. Half of it was under construction, and we were in the other half. And it was a great time. That house was a lot of fun, and the Marlin was great. And that's when the drag show I told you about, when I conspired to bring Rachel and Dina and Vicky down. And I remember Vicky came, and um, Rachel and Dina left, and Vicky stayed for a while. And that's when John uh, picked her up, and she went and performed at the Copa. And then the next thing, she was on, moving down to Key West. But I introduced her to a guy named David, who was a bartender at the Marlin for many, many years. And David, um, that was his taste in people. And he and Vicky met, and they were together for quite a while. And moved to when she moved to Key West, he went with her, and they were together quite a while. But those were the days. But she went off, and I remember her doing muscles and came out in this slinky number with all these hot guys around her, and brought the Copa down. It was great, and it was such a fun time. People would come to the Marlin, spend all day, then we'd go to the Copa and dance all night and then start all over again.
Now, I just got back a couple days ago from Wilton Manors, which for people who don't know, Wilton Manors is a little tiny town about 2 square miles on the northern edge of Fort Lauderdale. It's its own town with its own mayor and everything. But for all intents and purposes, it is the new Fort Lauderdale gay scene because they've got 2 dozen gay bars and restaurants on a 3/4 of a mile strip of road. So it's an amazing environment. And one of the people that I hung out with while I was there this weekend was George Kessinger. And George he mentioned to me, and I didn't know this, that he kind of got his start also um, at the Marlin Beach, that he worked there for some time before he did Club Caribbean, before he had Georgie's Alibi, before he had Bad Boys, any of those involvements that he had in the community, that he was at the Marlin Beach too. It was kind of like an iconic rite of passage for anybody that was going to be anybody in the gay community in the entertainment scene to go through Marlin Beach. And I think the only other thing that was nearby, Cathode Ray was kind of walking distance.
Yeah, that
If you
came
wanted a
later
video
after.
bar, and that was trendy, that was groundbreaking too, because back in the day, you know, bars didn't have TVs in them.
Yeah,
And
I think
here's
it was
this,
on Las Olas Boulevard,
yeah,
actually, if I
I
remember.
think they had 2 different locations on Las Olas over the years. Um, but to go into a bar that had multiple video screens and you could watch whatever it was, whether it was MTV or some random TV show
Yeah.
or something, it was just a novelty. And there were so many groundbreaking places there. And like you mentioned, some of the entertainers, Sylvester, Divine, Madonna, before they became the superstars that they eventually became, they would go down there before Madonna even knew what South Beach was. She would go to Fort Lauderdale and party at the gay club. She would perform at um, the Copa or whatever, and that even maintained a little bit into the '90s. The bar that is now in Wilton Manors, that is now known as the Wilton Manors Eagle, originally was Tropics, not Tropics, Palms, then Chardy's, and then Bill's Filling Station. And when it was Bill's, uh, Stephanie Gianotte came and did an impromptu performance there. We know her now as Lady Gaga, but you still see it was like a groundbreaking scene for entertainment for the gay world. It was pretty amazing.
Well, here's the wild thing. Back in the day of the Marlin, we were seasonal and the opposite season of Provincetown. So there were a
Correct.
whole horde of people that would leave Fort Lauderdale to go to Provincetown or other areas in the area and then come back. And we had a whole group of people that did. And then Wilton Manors, I have to tell you something fun. When I was at the Marlin, one of the servers there, Randy Elton, who's on this group, we lived together. We had a house in Wilton Manors before Wilton Manors is what it is today. It was like a sleepy residential community. I remember I think a house was green and it had all jalousie windows in it back then you had and we lived there and I'm sure if he hears this he's going to remember and think about look what happened to Wilton Manors. We were way ahead of our time back then because we had this house in Wilton Manors that was absolutely really nothing except a little sleepy residential community. And look what it is today.
Yeah, they were little kind of 1950s Florida ranch houses, 2 bedroom, 1 bath, maybe 3 bedroom, 1 bath. Um, and ultimately, by the time you got into the late 80s and 90s, it was almost undesirable. You know, nobody wanted to live there. When George Kessinger opened the Alibi in the shops of Wilton Manors, that plaza was 50% empty, and the other 50% was basically vagabonds and homeless people that would collect treasures on the side of the road and then sell them in a rickety storefront as a thrift store. It had no real business to speak of other than a few little places. And just the other day, a friend of mine who's lived in Wilton Manors for about 3 years, owns a couple of bars there. Um, he put his house on the market. It originally was a 3 bedroom, 1 bath, completely remodeled about 4 years ago into a 5 bedroom, 5 bath. But it's on the market right now for 2.5 million, which is a far cry from, the maybe six figures they might have been able to ask 25 years ago for some of those houses. It's
Leave
it's
it to the gays,
amazing.
right? Leave it to the. I know when I moved to San Francisco here, Hayes Valley and that area, you didn't go there at night back in the and when I moved here in the early 90s. And now it's now called the sick now it's called bigger than Silicon Valley as far as tech, and the housing is unbelievable. So I think we have a history of going in and taking over. I mean, the Castro started that way, quite frankly. It was an Italian community once upon a time, and the gays came in and took it over, and look what it is today. So we have a history of going into places like that and bringing them back and making them fabulous.
Well, look at Atlanta in Midtown.
So
when you move
true.
when you move to Midtown, even when I moved to Atlanta in the early 80s, that was not a pretty place to be.
Yeah.
There were some
Oh, it was a
beautiful
safer
Victorian
site.
homes that had been abandoned. People decided to go out to what they called the suburbs, like Buckhead, which they were going out of town. And there were a lot of gay bars in Midtown because the real estate was pretty
Cheap.
undesirable. The homes were inexpensive, and it was not a pretty neighborhood. And now, the very site where Backstreet and the Armory sat is now a high-rise luxury condominium building that I guarantee you cannot get anything in that building under $1 million. I mean, not the smallest efficiency size condo. It's crazy, but it's again the same thing. The gay community goes in, they build it up, they bring business, they bring, you know, this gentrification, and next thing you know, the cool suburbanites are coming in and going, "Hey, I'm going to sell my suburban home, and I'm going to move to this cool neighborhood," and the prices go through the roof. So it's crazy. And
Yeah,
Wilton
there's a
Manors is exactly that. I cannot tell you how many multi-million dollar homes there are. I mean, almost everything in that town is over $1 million if it's a freestanding home of any quality. Doesn't matter. Just the land is worth that much. So we got to figure out where we're going to go next
that's
and hope we
true.
live
It's
long enough to
it's
profit from it.
it's already happening. We just haven't heard about it yet.
Right? Absolutely. So South Florida, you were there for how long?
The first time I was there, I went to Miami in 76, and then I went to Atlanta 78, and then I went back to the Marlin in, it was either late 82, I think 82, 83 time period, and before I escaped Florida altogether.
I've thought about escaping Florida because of the politics mostly, but we have a few pockets like Wilton Manors that are very, very gay friendly. And I have a hard time with the climate, finding a climate like this anywhere else. I'm not a big fan of winter. Yesterday it was 51 degrees in Tampa. That's way too cold for my taste. So I haven't really found the ideal place, and I'm not sure I want to go to a foreign country just yet, for fear that they might throw all the Americans out.
Have to come visit me in
Um,
Maui, Art.
there we go. So I know you've got a lot more bar stories to talk about. We've got other cities. We've got, San Francisco. You've got all your experiences in Hawaii. But I don't want this interview to run on forever. And I do want to have a little bit of a chance to talk about my life in business suits, hospital gowns, and high heels. It's a new book. Everybody can see it right over your shoulder that you've got out. Tell us about that book, how you were inspired to write it, and what kind of things people can learn from it.
Thank you, Art, for bringing it up. I've been so fortunate. It's won 3 book awards. I was on a billboard in Times Square a few weeks ago. It's just been gone wild, and I've been a really private man and kept all of this stuff secrets for years. And I wrote this book, and it stops about 15 years ago, and it starts. I grew up in a shack. We actually called it the shack. We didn't have hot water or a refrigerator. My dad brought home a block of ice every day, so that's how it started out. And it takes you through me with I've had 2 life-threatening illnesses, been given 6 months to live 3 times. I was told the first one, AIDS, was terminal, and I'm in my 37th year. I've had metastatic cancer now for 14, and I'm still here. And I felt it was time to share some of this information, not only about the early days of my life and about the heels part of my life, about hospital gowns, that flimsy piece of fabric that never ties well in the back that I've been through, as well as I've been in corporate 500 companies. I've worked for some of the largest companies from MCI, for those of that remember it. I ran the head of customer service at Walmart.com, ran global service operations for Palm. I was in the first 75 employees at Facebook. I set up all their initial customer operations, and on and on and on of things that I did in that corporate life. And fell in love, got married, and kind of traveled the world for a while and realized that I wasn't into the retirement thing, and came back and I'm doing what I'm doing now, which I'm a coach and a speaker and an author. I have a few more books coming, and I'm the CEO of a coaching academy and have my own podcast. But this book, the purpose was who we are today is the sum parts of who we've been in our lifetime. In fact, some of those parts may be outrageous, they may be private. We may feel shame for them. We may feel that somebody might not even understand. But you wouldn't be who you are today without all those parts. You would likely be someone else, because those parts were part of who you were that got you to who you are today, and to celebrate those. So it's a story hoping to inspire others to go through some times of risk, resilience, and reinvention, as I've had to do. I've heard things when I can't put this book down, to I laughed, I cried, I did both at once. It's been really, really touching and quite liberating for me to share all of this. And it's been well received. And I'm really, really fortunate. And there's more to come. So that's the exciting part. There's more of it. But this book has a lot about what we've talked about today, and many more. It chronicles, of course, coming out and Gainesville, and the stories, some of them that I've shared today in more detail. So that's what it's about. My life in business suits, hospital gowns, and high heels, in control, being control, and out of control.
And to me, the important thing about books like this is it gives people who have never met you, who don't really know you, um, an opportunity to comprehend the diversity and the depth of the members of our community. You see people on the street. If you're traveling, you go to a gay destination, you look at a guy and you think, oh, he probably is a mechanic, or and he's a fun guy, and all he thinks about is sex with bears or whatever. But when you get a book like this, you get to see all the different facets of who you are and who you have been, and it kind of opens your mind to the fact that it doesn't apply just to you. Every single person that you run into in a bar, in a restaurant, in a store, on the beach, those people all have deep and intricate stories that have made them who they are today. And it's amazing if you take the time to sit down and talk to them. Everybody has something to teach you. Um, Ever since I started the Gay Barchives project, I've had a lot of people tell me over time, well, you don't really want to talk to me about my gay bar history. I'm nobody. I just went to the bars. And I'm like, everybody's story is equally important. The guy who owned the bar does not have the most important story about the bar. It's the people who lived it, the people who made the community, the people who experienced it and who had an impact on their life. I've interviewed several of the people that you've mentioned. Chad Michaels was one of them. Chad Michaels told me in his interview, and I thought this was particularly surprising because he's in, the big Hollywood Vegas scene. He's in San Diego now, I believe. Um, but he's been at the top of the drag world as a world famous Cher impersonator. And, and I said, what was your most memorable experience in the gay bar scene? He said, well, I've never been a pageant queen. I've never had a title. I'm just a performer who puts my all on stage. And when I was invited to come and perform at the Parliament House in Orlando, I knew I had made it. And the Parliament House will always have a special place in my heart because it opened the door for me to a
Yeah.
different level of performance. And you never know those kind of things. Those are not the stories that you hear
No.
when you do research on Parliament House, at the library or at the archives.
Well,
And
the
so
Parliament House has a special place for many of us. We used to sneak away there, and some of the greats were there. Jimmy D, Wendy Grape. There's so many I'm forgetting, and I apologize. But Chad Michaels, I don't know if he's still doing it, but he had the Dream Girls review at Moe's in San
I
Diego.
think he
So
does. I think
my
he
ex and
does.
I, we had a place down in San Diego, and we used to always go to watch it because Moe's is another one of those places that you kind of have different bars within a bar, and this bar, this big stage and everything would turn in the Dream Girl Review, and it's another one that reminds you of going back in time because Chad puts on production numbers. He doesn't just do a drag show; it's a full-blown production number. And Chad is just an amazing professional, one of those people that has the movements, the body movements, and how he holds himself. No matter what character he's playing, he captures it with absolute grace, ease, and beauty and skill. I remember the first time I met Chad, I actually met Cher, and I was at a fundraiser for Hillary, and I got to meet Cher, which was, by the way, everybody, if you haven't met her, she's tiny. We all think she's huge. She's like a tiny human being and delightful. And I remember meeting Chad that night, and such a personable, wonderful guy, and so real. And but he is talk about a professional. He's a professional that grew up in it and knew how to really polish it to perfection, and runs an incredible show.
Absolutely. And in the interview, I didn't know what to expect when we scheduled the interview. He did the interview out of drag and no pretense at all. He was just, hi, I'm here. This is me. Let's talk. And that is so refreshing because some of the people that I've interviewed, it's almost like they wanted to be on stage, but the true greats, the ones that are really um, dedicated to their work and have confidence in what they've done. Charlie Brown's another one. Charlie Brown was in a brown leather recliner and a plaid shirt when I interviewed him. He was not trying to say, hey, look at me, I can put on nails and makeup and be fancy. He was just telling a story. And so it's so nice to see that there's still people out there like that. And there's still people that are that dedicated to their art. And
Yeah, well, many of those that you're speaking of were in it for the entertainment. Not that everybody wasn't in the entertainment, but there's, like any community we have, some of the drags back then were heading towards being trans, some of them were heading, but then there was this group we're talking about that were about entertainment. Um, I remember Dana Manchester, John Goodwin. John was trained, I think, at Juilliard, and it was all about in the early days theater for him. And he was very much John and adorable out of Dana land. But and I think what you're speaking to is were those kind of people are real humans outside of that persona we see of who we see. Like Charlie's a perfect example, the bitch of the South. Well, when you watch Charlie perform, you were watching the bitch of the South, but when you got time to spend with Charlie, he was just a good old Southern boy.
Absolutely. A good old Tennessee farm boy. Um, he was amazing. And he certainly had plenty of stories to tell as well.
Yeah, I hope you can get Rachel Wells, John, to do an interview with at some point because John, I can promise you, has some stories. I mean, he wrote a book that we can all get, but John has some stories he's probably sitting on, so that we'd all love to hear about from those days. And there were so many of them that were such incredible entertainers, and they were so dedicated to the craft. It was really quite amazing. Of course, we have them today, we have that same thing today.
The difference now, though, and this is, kind of just to go back to the beginning of where we started today. Um, but one of the one of the things that has been an ongoing theme with Atlanta is that so many of these iconic people that performed at the Sweet Gumhead went on to other cities in the South or across the country and continued. And Atlanta was like almost like the factory that produced all these people, even up to another person you mentioned earlier, and we didn't really talk about RuPaul. RuPaul, when you met him in Atlanta, when I met him in Atlanta, he was a young, skinny, tall black boy wearing Daisy Duke shorts and a cutoff t shirt, dancing on a plywood box in a tiny neighborhood bar, putting up posters saying, world famous RuPaul at weekends tonight or whatever. And he wasn't world famous. He wasn't even famous in Atlanta at but he had that attitude and look where it's taken him now.
Look where
So,
RuPaul is today. Exactly. Yes, it's so true. And then there
and
were the greats in Chicago at the Baton we haven't talked about. The one and only Chili Pepper. We'll have to talk about some of those people one day because Chili was that was a perfect name for Chili Pepper for sure. And Miss Continental and people that went that path. And uh,
Jim Flint,
so many of those people that are amazing. And I mean, now we have greats like Sasha Colby that is just an unbelievable performer. Last show I saw of her, she was on tour, and I felt like I was in Las Vegas, the show she put on. And then, of course, here in San Francisco, we'll have to touch on her one day, Darcy Drollinger, who's been in a few movies and owns the Oasis. And she brings talent from everywhere to perform at the Oasis. So if you're ever here in San Francisco, make sure you go. But Darcy's mission is all about the Oasis Foundation, where it's for the arts. It just happens to include performance and drag. But that bar, you can go to the Oasis and earlier in the night watch something that has nothing to do with drag and see the best show you ever saw. But it's more like theater when you see the Varla Jean Mermans come and people like that are performing and such diversity that goes on there of serving people and such a safe place to go and and be who you are and celebrate and enjoy yourself. It's fascinating and I just love our community and I think it's such an important time for us to remember that I know I said it earlier that we are much more successful and make strides in our lives when we're together. We don't have to look alike. We don't have to have the same letter of the alphabet. There's so much about us that can still be different, but we are much better and a much better force to reckon with when we're locked arms in some. I just had the pleasure of being at the grand opening or reopening of the Castro Theater here in San Francisco that was closed down for about 4.5 years and a $41 million restoration. Well, everyone was there and it was just so great. And the thing I loved about it was watching the energy from our mayor to the city state senator to the city councilman to all the drag stars to all the leather stars, you name it, everybody was there representing. And as this grand theater reopened, and as I looked across all these people, I thought, this is what we're about. This is how we come together and how we continue progressing gay rights.
absolutely. Well, I'm so glad we had this time to talk about some of your experiences and kind of capture the tip of the iceberg. But we'll definitely have to do another segment and talk more about some of the other cities that you've had experiences in, and talk more about your drag career and the fabulous people that you've met along the way. So thank you so much, Tom, for taking the time and being with us today.
Thank you, Art. It's been a delight. I really enjoyed it, and thank you for what you're doing for us with Gay Barchives. You're changing and bringing back memories and reminding us of so many good times and so many things that we did and places we were at that would be lost in a memory. And you brought them back to life. And I know I, along with many others, are so grateful.